Hi Omar.
How are you?
I'm good. How you doing?
I'm okay. I'm okay. I apologize. I the book tour started in earnest yesterday, and so I promptly lost my voice and then regained
Ah,
it, and I'm just getting my sea legs under me, so I apologize in advance.
no, no worries. You were at Brian Eno's studio, I think, yesterday, right, for the book launch.
Easily the most surreal book experience I've had, I think, in my career. Yeah.
I was actually with him in Brussels. We organized like this big event in Brussels at the weekend. So he told me he was seeing you on Monday, and he loved the book. So yeah, that's the book. It's weird because it looks like advertising, but it is and it's not. But it's just a really brilliant book. Uh, I, so it's called One Day Everyone Will Always Have Been. No, will have always been against this. And it's actually out today in the UK. We are releasing the video on Thursday, so I think that's the day of the launch. I finished it this morning. I found it to be incredibly moving, deep, very beautiful. For me, it's about so many things, about exile, about language, about resistance, about belonging or not belonging, which actually in some ways reminded me of Edward Said, Out of Place, Said's book. So yeah, it's about us and them. It's about the other. It's also about obviously Gaza, the U.S. empire, the invisibilisation of people all over the world in pursuit of profit. So I have to tell you something before we start, and I'm really honest. I reading the book, every kind of 2 pages, a question for you arised. So there are, I think, 187 pages, which would have made about 93 questions. So I had to make some hard choices. But thank you for this book. I think it's honestly a gift to us. So thank you.
That's very generous. That's much more generous than I deserve. Thank you. I appreciate it.
So I will shut up in about a minute now. I'm going to ask my first question. I'm going to start from the beginning of the book because early in your book, you recount an incident that you witnessed in Doha between a local and a South Asian man. You saying in the book he was either maybe Indian or Pakistani. You write about the South Asian man. He had violated the bounds of his assumed non-existence. Then his non-existence is necessary to the self-conception of this place, and how uncontrollable is the rage whenever that non-existence is violated. For me, this describes October the 7th. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, I think it describes essentially in one form or another every kind of unspoken social covenant and social agreement that you sign in any given society. I mean, I was back in Qatar for the first extended period in about 20 years. Last November I was there. And I was walking around, and as you might expect from having read this book, I'm generally a pretty angry guy right now. And I was thinking to myself, it's just nice to be in a place where brown people are thriving and are not sort of this weird side exception. And I had to stop myself and say, well, hold on, brown people aren't thriving here. The majority of them are building these skyscrapers for minimum, sort of at extreme personal risk, and they're being um, paid nothing for it, or near nothing for it. And again, I had so easily slipped back into that mode of just, those folks don't exist. And so for me, it's the entirety of Israel's relationship to Palestine, not just October 7th or anything that happened beyond there, but just how easy it is to fall into a mode where everything sorts itself out so long as you pick a single group of people and just say, they are out of the bounds of my frame of reference.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like, and you also talk about following this incident, this kind of cognitive dissonance that a lot of the people, I mean, even more so in Western societies, need to feel safe within way themselves, But when the risk, in a way, as you write, is an indictment of an entire narrative once, the invisible becomes visible, because it sort of risks everything and changes everything. And again, I feel that this is exactly what Israel has done to the Palestinians. It's invisibilized them. People are playing beach volley in Tel Aviv while Gaza is being starved. But when they appear, they need, like a bully, they need to smash them very hard to go back to the state of oh, we okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I've tried and probably failed to contend with, particularly over the last year and a half, but probably much longer than that, is within a kind of settler colonial enterprise. And I'm thinking here as well of the part of the world that I live in. I mean, I moved from Canada to the U.S. I spend most of my time in North America. There's a kind of binary that needs to exist, and it's indicative of this extreme imaginative poverty, by which I mean something monstrous is happening. Something monstrous has happened. Therefore, there must be a monster in the equation. And if it's not the people having this done to them, who's left? And so, narratively, if I exist on the privileged end of that relationship, it is an existentially important matter that I believe in a narrative where the monster is not me. And so, I can fully understand why that is not something that you can half buy into. You can't sort of align yourself with that kind of thinking, right? But the problem is that all that's left at that point is this incredibly cruel binary where you are either wearing the boot or you are stepping on the neck. And if you're telling me not to step so hard on the neck, then you clearly want me to take off the boot and now my neck is going to get stepped on. And it completely suffocates any opportunity for a better world than this, for a better way of being than this. But I understand that once you buy into it, you have to buy in wholesale. There's no other choice.
I was also wondering, I spoke to Max Porter, I think a few months ago now, and I think he's actually written a blurb for the book, right? If I'm correct.
We're doing an event tonight, actually.
Oh.
He's very generously agreed to be my conversation partner in London tonight.
See, small world, and I'm sure it's going to be amazing because I love Max. I think he's I think he's great. But I remember asking him, and as a writer, how do you write while a genocide is going on? And in a way, how does it affect you and change you as an author?
Yeah, I mean, there's an entire chapter in the book where I try and probably fail to sort of contend with this, because I think there is a comforting dynamic within writing, within literature, within the practice of this craft, where you come to believe that the art cannot be sullied by these things, cannot be sullied by the everyday political and all of this sort of gutter stuff. We're artists. We rise above it all, and we tell you something about the moon. And again, I'm being flippant here. I understand, but there's a bigger problem, at least for me personally, in that construction, which is that all my favorite writers write about the moon. I'm a sucker for that view of art. I'm a sucker for that kind of art. But there comes a certain point where you have to contend with the highest purpose of art, which is to say something about being human. And so it becomes impossible for me, as much as I want to, and I tell you now, and this is an act of cowardice on my part, I want to go back to writing about the moon. I want nothing more than to retreat in my comfortable home on the launching side of the missiles where my tax dollars pay to kill these kids, and I want to disappear and write my silly stories and live in the art, because I have the privilege of all of those things. There's just a certain line that has been crossed where I can no longer call myself a writer, where I've abandoned too much of the obligation to say something about what it means to be human. by looking away from this. And so I tell you as a coward that I would much rather not have written this book, not have been put in a position to write this book. I don't know what this book is going to do, if anything, but you have to at some point wonder what the hell it is you are, right? Uh, it's not, you know, all writing is political. It's either political by virtue of its active space or its negative space. You give me a fun beach read set in East Jerusalem and there's not a single Palestinian in it. That's a political book. It's just political by virtue of its negative space. Um, and so that to me was the choice. I was gonna write all my writing was gonna be political. It was just a matter of, was I going to act political actively or was I going to act political by looking away?
Yeah, it's interesting because Max sort of, following his visit to Palestine, I think in November or October, when we spoke, pretty much said the same thing. Like, what the hell do I want to write about anymore if it's not the reality? But a big part of your book is also kind of a diary of you waking up every morning and seeing more horrors, more sadism, more children dying, and more active complicity of your country, government, and more denial and more dehumanization. I think we've all felt this. I mean, maybe not all, unfortunately, but a lot of us have felt this over the last 16 months. So was writing for you also a way to cope with these images?
It's a good question, and I've been trying to think about that because it's a very natural question that I ask myself. What did this do to write this the way I did? But two things come to mind immediately. The first is just how pathetic a framing that is on my part, to sort of center myself, and how much this has messed me up when people are suffering through this, right? But I think it is worth addressing in the aggregate because I think it's going to take a very long time to understand the communal damage that this slaughter has done to the souls of the people who watched it from a distance and who have to live with their action or inaction. You know, we're all going to be held to account, not by some external party, but by our own conscience. Um, and I don't know the ways in which the last year and a half have broken me. You know, I say without hyperbole that I killed those kids. I did that. My tax money did that. And how much time have I spent mourning these people and mourning what I have done? Um, the writing is all I know how to do. I'm no good at anything else. It's also my first avenue of retreat. You know, when the world stops making sense, as it quite often does, I sit with that on the page. And so, in that sense, I suppose there must have been some kind of catharsis. Um, but it's it feels like the smallest goddamn thing. I wrote a fucking book. Who cares? Um, there are people who have done so much, and from whom I have leached so much courage. Um, and they are doing this against the power, the centers of power of the Western world, the institutional power centers of the Western world. That is a fairly formidable opponent. Um, in that context, it becomes very hard for me to assess the book as a means of personal catharsis, um, which is my very rambling roundabout way to tell you that let's check back on that question 5 years from now.
I totally understand. Um, Despite again, like, organizing non-stop for the last 16 months, with obviously others from all over the world and stuff, and despite I can't help but feel, and that's only me speaking, deep down, that however we try to convince ourselves that we did our best, we failed Gaza.
So,
And
this is what I have a problem with because you know, there is that impulse in me to constantly be in that mode. But also, I firmly believe that every last little thing anyone does matters and makes a difference. And so, as with so many things in this book, and as with so many thoughts I've had over the last year and a half in particular, but over the last, quarter century essentially, there's a kind of conflicting impulse. This is true of another section of the book, for example, where I talk about this idea of leave taking. You know, do I want to ditch these organizations that have shown themselves to be so utterly spineless, or do I want to stay in the room so that I can hopefully move them? And more often than not, I want to leave because I don't think that I'm changing the room. I think the room is now changing me. But I can't pretend that conflict doesn't exist across the board. Once you are done aligning yourself with the system of power, you have to make everything by hand now. You have to make your own systems, you have to find your own solidarity, you have to do all of this stuff. And I think that's a central privilege of having the system serve you. So you don't have to think about any of these things, any of these contradictions. They go out the window.
You talked in your book about the fact that as an immigrant to the West from Egypt, you believed at the time that the West promised freedom. This idea, this myth, don't you think it's like one of the most important successes of like US imperialism? This like promised land.
I mean, I think of imperialism generally as an act of endless taking. It's insatiable, right? And it starts with the very tangible things. It starts with the land and the resources and the lives of the people who get in the way, et cetera, et cetera. But it extends to more abstract things like narrative. Um, and the narrative, I think, is much easier at a surface level than it is once one starts to think very deeply about it. On every surface level, I'm far freer living in the United States than if I had stayed in Egypt. There's no doubt in my mind. And that has been brought up to me over and over again, right? It's sort of shorthand for what someone really wants to say, which is, why don't you go back where you came from, right? And I get that. And then you start to think more deeply about the interplay of power and what it does to a country that has been on the receiving end of imperialism or colonialism, and the kind of ingrained cruelty that comes with permanent resistance, where you resist and you become more antagonistic, and then one day you might be taking it out on your own people. And all of these things create currents that I think we can disagree about, but we can at least have a thoughtful conversation about. This narrative of, America is the land of the free, you have freedom here, so shut the hell up, is in of itself sort of absurd, right? It's absurd in its kind of simplicity, and I think it's indicative not of any desire to engage in a thoughtful interrogation of what freedom means within the heart of an empire, but rather to just get someone to shut up, and so again, it's a very difficult thing for me to sit here and tell you that on a surface level I would be freer if I went back to Egypt. No, if I wrote this version of this book in Egypt, you wouldn't hear from me ever again. I'm just interested in interrogation of empire because the empire, narratively, doesn't appear to be.
Talking about empire, something the Gaza genocide has done is to put everything in focus. It's a moment of extreme clarity for millions of people around the world. A moment that in a book you called a rupture. In my opinion, extreme clarity, understanding power, what capitalism, colonialism, imperialism are about, should definitely lead to a rupture. But I'm not convinced it will. Are you?
No, and I should say that, because writing is a fairly lonely profession, a lonely craft, for a long time I'm in my little writing room and I'm putting this down on paper, and I'm not entirely sure that anybody feels the same way I do. I've had many, many conversations since with people who, for the first time, and not from a place of glee or anything like that, are starting to question what it is, their relationship with whatever this is can be. Um, I'm talking to people who might be of Arab descent but have never left North America and are now suddenly starting to look around in the world and trying to think of where they might find a place that doesn't force them into so many daily contradictions with respect to their own conscience. Um, I I think one of the central difficulties of a moment like this is that the violence and the slaughter is so immediate. You wake up every day and you see evidence of the worst things human beings can do to one another. And the complicity is so immediate. You know who's funding this. You know where these weapons are coming from. You know what your own society's role is. That it makes it very difficult to engage in a sort of run of the mill kind of obliviousness. You need a much higher grade weaponized obliviousness to look away from this. But none of that changes the fundamental asymmetry in terms of standing up to it, which is to say that if you are opposed to what is happening right now, here's what is expected of you: to agitate against it, to risk your livelihood, to risk not being invited to dinner parties anymore because you're the troublesome one who keeps bringing this up, to risk arrest. If you are on board with what is happening, all you are being asked to do is look away. And so there's a fundamental asymmetry of effort that leads me to be deeply uncertain about the answer to that question, when otherwise I would say, yes, absolutely.
And in a way, we go back to something you address in your book as well, which is the question, why is it so hard to make a person care for someone other than their own? And the thing of like, what matters is it's not us getting bombed. It's in a way, it's a normal feeling to have, but caring for the other is something that we find very difficult to do.
Yeah, and I think it's part and parcel with the trajectory of at least the part of the world I live in, and I suspect the part of the world you live in as well, which is this conflation of convenience and betterment. Um, you know, yes, last year my Amazon package used to take 3 days to show up. Now it takes 2 days. Therefore, the world is getting better. No, the world for a small sliver of people is getting more convenient. And so once you flip that around, the anything that might inconvenience someone becomes apocalyptic because you're at a state of such privilege that that's the worst thing that could possibly happen to you. I can't count the number of times I've seen protests discussed on the major news networks in the United States where someone is just genuinely livid at how much this has held up traffic. People can't get to work now. You're not helping any your cause, you're not getting people on side. Sure, if everybody is completely obsessed with the idea of convenience as the fundamental proxy of life, then yeah, absolutely. But I think it's worth just thinking about how incredibly empty this makes us in our relationships. How it strips us of our humanity to think nothing of the fact that it is so outlandishly easy to not give a shit about someone who isn't us. And the thought that that doesn't come back and bite you in the ass eventually, I think, is equally ludicrous. But even if it didn't, even if you knew for a fact that it would never come to your door, makes it no less ruinous to the soul to look away, I think.
My last question is gonna be me going back to the title of the book and hopefully not messing it up. One day, everyone will have always been against this. This is what I've been telling myself for months. This is what I've been telling my friends for months. Exactly that. One day, everyone will have always been against this. I think that, and I'm wondering how I will deal with it, because we see people, we saw them 16 months ago. Now we see everything, social media and stuff. We know deep down who was always against this from the beginning, and we know in 5 years that people might say we will always have been against this. But with time passing, and a short example, I remember after Operation Cast Lead in 2008, 2009, where Israel again bombed Gaza, killed about 1,400 people in 3 weeks. I felt this was a changing moment. I felt this was going to change everything. And with time passing, it didn't really. And now we are at this genocide. I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people have died, are going to die. And I'm not convinced anymore that one day everyone will always have been against this.
Yeah, I think that there's two things that come to mind with the title, and I've had a lot of conversations exactly along the lines of what you're talking about, and I've had them with myself as well. But I think there's two things that come to mind. The first is timelines. There's this beautiful book of poetry that I go back to quite often called Whereas by Layli Long Soldier. A few years ago, the US government issued this proclamation saying effectively, sorry about all the genocide, indigenous people, and it was, hundreds of years too late to have actually stopped any of it. And she took the wording of that resolution and she turned it into an indictment. Those are the kind of timelines that I'm thinking about here. The other thing is that as much as I'm convinced this is going to happen, there is nothing remotely victorious or celebratory about that moment, because it's gonna be built on top of the bones of so many people who did not have to die, right? And so, as a form of framing, yeah, it's contentious, and we know now where everybody stands. I mean, that's been one of the clarifying things about this particular period. But I think the reason I started thinking in that mode was to immediately leave that mode and say to myself that it doesn't matter. You do the work. You do the work regardless. Because I do think that with respect to this issue in particular, but so much injustice around the world, there's a thick middle chunk of people who are not pro-Israel, they're not pro-Palestine, they are pro whatever the hell gets me through the day. And so you work on changing the conditions. You don't work on changing the minds of somebody who the next morning could wake up and the wind has changed slightly and they change back. That's not worth your time, I don't think. But yes, there are days when I wake up and think, maybe the slaughter has to be 10 times as much before certain people are moved. I don't know. I don't know what people are like anymore, and it makes it very difficult to function as a writer when you've lost that ability to understand why somebody feels something, or more to the point, doesn't feel something.
Thanks, Omar. I again appreciated your book so much, and I appreciated this conversation as much as I did appreciate the book. So thanks, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you for the work you do.